So we're sort of at the same time as we're doing all this design stuff, we've got our OT coming in and telling us all these things about the environment and the impact it has and how we should structure our family to make things easier for Darcy and for us. And it's been this really interesting sort of dual pathway of understanding our own sensitivities and trying to build a house at the same time.
Building involves more than just personal style. It's about budget, functionality, working with your specific site, and making sure your home seamlessly integrates into your life. I'm Sam Payne, and welcome to Australian Build Stories. Join me as we chat with real people who've embarked on their own building journey. We'll explore their highs, lows, and valuable lessons they learned along the way. Australian Build Stories, building knowledge one story at a time. Hello and welcome to another episode of Australian Build Stories. I'm your host Sam Payne, and today we are going to be chatting with Jen, who you just heard a little snippet from, about her renovation journey. And I guess this is one where the conversation started being focused on the renovation and the house, but Jen is very open and shared a lot about her middle son Darcy. And just before they embarked on their renovation, Darcy received an autism diagnosis, and she shares a lot about what that meant for that design, and I found it really interesting. And the focus pivoted a little bit away from the detail of the renovation and more around what it meant for Jen and her husband Andrew to learn about that and how that sort of impacted their space, and how now Darcy has gone from having some trouble in that space to thriving and growing more into the boy he is becoming. So it was a really nice, honest conversation. I really enjoyed it. It'll be a great one if you're thinking about a renovation, but also if you do have kids with sensory preferences or sensory sensitivities, it'll be really interesting, as well as for any kids who could be on the spectrum. The house Jen purchased is a classic character home, and the renovation was retaining the front part of the home and one wing, and then extending on to the back of that, as well as adding a bit of a parents' retreat upstairs. And today's episode is proudly sponsored by Home-Based Design and Build Centre, Australia's largest building and renovation destination. Let's get started with the show. Welcome, Jen.
Thanks. Great to be here.
Being here in your house. Thank you for the tour. We've done a walkthrough of the renovation, which has been great to see.
Yeah, no. You're lucky the cleaners came. It's looking very fancy today, which it does not normally look this tidy.
I know the feeling. We both have three young kids, so it's a constant state of toys and objects moving throughout the house.
Yeah, definitely.
So to start, if you can give me a bit of a high level overview of how you guys came to purchase this place.
So we actually lived about 300 metres away around the corner for 9 years before we actually bought this house.
Yep.
And my husband's quite specific about what he likes. I'm probably a bit more flexible and have a bit more, I guess, open to interpretation in areas, whereas he kind of wanted to live closer to this particular shopping centre near us because he liked where we lived. So there was about four streets.
What's the shopping centre?
Floreat 4. Not a fancy shopping centre for those who don't know.
Just a normal,
just a regular shopping centre. Yeah. But we really liked the area, and so he basically wanted to live in these 5 streets, which made it a little bit tricky with the market. We sort of looked quite a bit of a broader area, but we sort of kept running into this problem where a lot of people were transitioning, and it was probably this area where people had done renovations in the early 2000s, when I think the requirements and I guess what was in fashion was a bit different. And they'd spent quite a lot of money on those renovations. And so they sort of, you'd be looking at these houses where they would want you to pay quite a lot for the house on top of the land. But for us, a lot of it didn't meet what we would need. Also, Perth property market was insane for such a long time. We really struggled to find a house to buy at all. Yep. And then I think because we were in the area, it was quite easy to see what was coming up because we were literally so close.
Yeah. And then do you remember what it was like when you went to the home open?
Look, it was one of those things where you'd go, there'd be like 50 people here and you'd have to make a decision really quickly. I actually wrote an email to the sellers basically saying, because we'd been looking at this point for quite a long time, our middle son's autistic and we were getting to the point where we were like, we really need like a base and somewhere that's home, that sense of home. And so I happened to know that the people selling this house also had an autistic child. So I actually wrote them an email being like, we really need this house, essentially.
Yep.
I don't know if that's what tipped it, but we were quite lucky because, yeah, it was almost like there were a lot of set date sales in Perth at that time.
Yep.
By submit your best offer by 5 p.m. And yeah, we'd missed out on probably 5 houses before we bought this one. So we were pretty happy when it eventually came off.
It gets exhausting, doesn't it?
Yeah. Home opens sound lovely in theory, but then when you're going to them and you actually just need to get it done, you get really over it.
Because you go, oh, yeah, this is the one. I've got a good feeling about it. And you start picturing yourself living there.
Yeah.
And then you don't get it, or you don't even get the chance to increase your offer, or those sorts of things. And you're like, oh.
Yeah, it's just so...
Do it again.
I mean, in one like fit of like, I'm like, we're never buying a house. I bought this enormous couch, like essentially because I was upset we hadn't got this other house. And so then we had to basically design this house around that couch because it was so big it didn't fit in a normal room. So it was lucky we were renovating and we could build around.
Is that the couch?
That's the couch out there. We're never selling it because the room's designed around it.
Very good. And then when you went through the home open, was it clear what you were going to have to do to the house?
Look, we knew we needed to do something, but not really, to be honest. We're not very experienced with building. I mean, we've watched Grand Designs, but that's probably the extent of our involvement. So we knew that we would need to make some changes because there were a few things that were not going to work for us. But essentially, we could have lived here. Like, it was certainly not in a state where we couldn't have moved in. But I think probably mainly because our middle son, that disruption, and also we were able to stay in the rental we were in for at least some of the time. So we thought, like, the less moves, the better.
Okay.
So we thought we'd be better off kind of just trying to do everything before we moved in.
Yeah, okay. So the idea of moving in for 18 months or something and moving out for Darcy would be too much?
Yeah, it felt like a bad idea. I mean, in the end, because of time frames, which I'm sure we'll talk about at some point, we ended up moving 3 times anyway.
Okay.
But, you know, the theory of moving once was really lovely to start with.
Yeah, okay. So you bought the place, settled, and then what was your first step after that?
We decided we wanted to get an architect. I think looking at so many houses, we'd sort of noticed that on the higher end of those sort of project build homes, that when you started looking at ones that had been built 10 or 15 years ago, you could really notice.
How so?
Yeah, just details. Like, it sounds silly, but like all the door handles and everything just looked a bit dated quicker than the architect build houses that we went through. Like the ones you could actually tell, sounds really snobby, but you could tell the difference between an architect built home and one of those sort of more project builds. And they're both good, I think, depending on where you're at. But because we knew the bones of this house were quite good and we could see that there were changes you could make, we just had decided quite early on, we thought, do it once, do it properly. So we thought we'd just never move again, considering it took us 5 years to buy a house, that we probably should really commit to where we're at.
Yeah. So we're going to be here for a long time. Let's get it done how we want to do it.
That's it,
Yeah. And then how did you find the architect?
So one of my bridesmaids actually married an architect, and so we were sort of looking. We'd already been following architects, I guess, on Instagram. And then I asked Nick, our friend, I was like, oh, do you know anyone? And he mentioned Simone Robeson, who he'd gone to uni with. And so we looked at her stuff and I was like, oh, yeah, I like her stuff. It suited the sort of vibe of the stuff we liked. And so we had a pretty detailed look through that, and then we just got in contact with her.
Yeah.
And we met with a couple of architects. She wasn't the only one. So we probably met with, I think we went with did three initial like chats. But Simone definitely was the one who I think understood what we needed rather than sort of putting designs forward that they liked, if that makes sense.
Yes. And then was there also, because sometimes when you're sitting down with 3 different people, there can just be more of a connection with someone as well?
It was just easy. You know, she was just like, we're quite casual, and she was pretty chilled, which we liked. It wasn't too intense and too much of I'm an artist vibes, but she clearly had ideas, which is what we wanted because we knew there were things. It's one of those things you sort of like, we knew there was a lot we didn't know, but we didn't know what that was exactly.
Yes, okay.
So she had lots of questions, which felt really good rather than just presenting us with options. She would have questions and then come up with some vague thoughts, which I think was really nice.
And was that still in that stage when you were talking with the 3 of them, or was that as a
That was at that initial meeting. So she's also the only one who asked to meet us on site for that initial meeting.
Interesting.
Which I thought was really interesting. The others had asked for like us to send links to the house and plans, but she actually came past just for a 15-minute chat really, but walked through and then just gave us some, I guess, off-the-cuff thoughts.
Sure.
Which I can understand for architects, like that, those ideas are their intellectual property as well. That is what they're selling, is their ideas. So I kind of was conscious that you couldn't expect them to give that away for free before you actually signed. But certainly that personal relationship and also her interest in the house, I think, was really attractive to us.
Good tip out there for any architects listening.
Yeah. Make sure you go see the house.
It makes sense.
Yeah.
I mean, you're going to be working on it for if you get the job, for the next 12 plus months.
Yeah.
It makes sense to go and see that place.
Yeah, you would have thought so.
Yeah. Yeah. And then in terms of that briefing process with Simone, what did that look like?
So I guess once we'd signed with them and sort of decided, that's who we're going with, we met her and one of her offsiders, Lauren, who is someone we worked with really closely during the build as well. And they actually walked us through, I guess, it felt like a psychological assessment of how we live our life, which was a really interesting process. And I had not expected that. So they asked us, how do you leave the house? What are you carrying? What makes it difficult to leave the house? Is it getting to the car? Is it carrying thousands of bags? What the physical process do you go through as you leave and enter your house? What are the patterns of your life? Where do you spend the most time? Was another one, which we'd always lived in old houses with terrible layouts and like really not well thought through things. So it was interesting to work through what was actually hard about those day-to-day tasks. And I'd never thought, I guess, of architecture as a way to solve some of those problems. I thought it was just small children and running around like a psycho, as opposed to something that we could make easier with the way where we live, that environmental impact, I guess, on your stress levels.
Yes. The functional benefits of architecture. It's come up a few times in the podcast, and the benefit your house has is that you're waking up there, you're starting the day there, and you're finishing the day there. So to have it in a way where it can accommodate your routine and your lifestyle, the start of the day, the end of the day is going to be better. You're going to feel better. You're going to be more productive.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I've met some other people sort of through my kids' school who do like interior architecture, but looking at that sensory sensitivities, because our middle son's autistic. So that was one of the other things we were really big on, is he's hypervisual. So we were told by his OT really early on that visual noise was really difficult for him. So one of the big things we were trying to do was create spaces with low visual noise, make some of those, and lots of different spaces, so he had different places to go to. And so that was, I guess, something else that came through as part of this briefing process. We're sort of telling them these details about our life which sound like they're not related to your house, but obviously are actually critically related to how regulated our family is as a unit, and I guess how impactful that environmental space is on Darcy, our middle son's experience of the world. And so that was another really key factor. And
have you found with Darcy in particular any change in his behaviour since being in the house?
Yeah, to be honest, I think that sense of home's been really important. It's his favourite place, and we've got a playroom. There's also his room we designed in particular to be kind of away from the busyness of the house, and we added some hooks in the ceilings because he's got like hammocks and sort of swings and stuff in his room, and he's really loved it. It's been really, I think, reassuring for him having such a secure space. Yeah.
So then going back to that process, so you'd had that sort of discovery questionnaire type phase, and then was it moving on to sketch designs?
Because I'm really terrible at picturing, I can't pick things up from a floor plan. Like my husband's much better at looking at things in 3D. Like Andrew can just see the space, whereas I really struggle to manipulate that in my brain. Like I can't.
It's very common.
I just can't do it. So they built as a model. There was obviously a drawing, but then they did an electronic fly-through of it essentially, so that we could get a better idea of what those sort of spaces would look like. And that was very helpful for me because I just can't do it. It's not helpful for me to look at a flat plan and try and make that into a 3D model in my head.
And did you see the design once? You're like, yep, that's the one.
Yeah, they kind of came up with a few different options. Like I think there was like A, B and C. And so it was this narrowing process of, we sent them a whole stack of things we liked. And me being me, I sent 50 images of the mud room because I was really excited about having somewhere to dump bags. And at one point Lauren was like, I think we understand what you need for the mud room. We don't need more pictures of that.
It's a few more.
Yes. So that was really carefully designed. But we eventually kept narrowing down, I guess, what we liked and what we didn't like. And then once we'd done that, we quick actually getting to a concept that we all fundamentally agreed on before we went to the sort of detail phase. Probably one important thing was I remember going through and we had all these ideas about what we'd do to the kids' wing of the house, which was existing. And then Simone was like, don't spend money on the kids. Spend money on the spaces that you live in the most. Like your children sleep in their rooms and they spend time there, but really that's not where you as a family spend time.
The value of spending money in those rooms is pretty low in terms of
Yeah, so basically she told us not to spend money on our children, so we didn't.
Good tip.
She was like, invest in the rooms that you live in and make the kids' rooms functional and good spaces, but you're probably going to want to change them as well as they grow. So really just make them blank canvases that you can evolve as the kids evolve.
There was an exercise we used to do when I had my firm, and it was getting people with their current floor plans to write, and you can sort of heat map it in a way with like highlighters or just writing 100%, put your percent of where you do spend most of your time or want to spend most of your time in the house, and you start to see pretty quickly that the bedrooms are very minimal percentages, if any.
Yeah, which you obsess about them so much mentally. You're like, oh, it's got to be X, Y, and Z, but really, you know, for us, the playroom, like not living in the toys was pretty big. We'd never had more than one living area. And I was like, I can't look at everything we own anymore. Like we need storage was quite big because, again, we'd lived in old houses with no cupboards.
Yep.
And so it was pretty quick. Like she kind of, I guess, was able to encourage us to think more carefully about where we're actually living in the house and how that we might be able to sort of invest our money in those specific areas, I guess, in a way that would be more useful moving forward. And she was big on sort of having light coming from particular areas and sort of, in my head, I always wanted really big windows, particularly upstairs, but I didn't understand, and it's probably not even until we moved in, the impact of high level windows, because I was like, oh, isn't that going to look like small and dark? And it's not at all, because she obviously understands light in a way that I don't.
Yes.
So it was really interesting that she was able, I guess, without us even realizing, to get through some of those things, which I now love about the house, but I didn't understand and was probably a bit concerned about at the time when we designed it. But yeah, the light and airflow has been amazing.
Yeah. And then so we'd completed the design. When did the builder start getting involved?
So basically right at the start, they offered us 2 levels of service. So Simone and Lauren sort of said, you know, we can do all the designs and it's this one price. I can't even remember now. And then otherwise we can manage the process through to handover and it's a higher price. And being, I guess, as busy as we were, we sort of thought, you know, and knowing nothing about building, we decided very early on that having someone hold our hand through was definitely a good strategy for us to kind of get some sort of result, because the idea, we watch enough grand designs to see that managing your own build seems to be a very bad idea if you have no skills in that area. So we knew that that was not a good position for us to be in. So we knew we needed someone to sort of spoon feed us through the process a bit. And so we were like, I think that whatever that surcharge is worth it for us. And to be honest, I think you need a third party between you and the builder so that you don't destroy that relationship. Like it was really useful at certain points where things might have got tricky, which they do just with any build. I don't think ours was particularly hard. But having someone who wasn't us able to be like, hey, where's that? That's meant to be done. Who could, I guess, be that checkpoint along the process. So Lauren was really that person for us. And she was, really amazing at being blunt in a way that I probably wouldn't have been.
Yeah.
Because I'd be worried, be like, oh, no, but, you know, if we upset him now, we're only this far from the end of the build and you just want to get a good job. So I think it's nice having a third party there.
And then in terms of what you did, it was basically opening it all up. It was a bit of a rabbit warren before from the floor plan I saw.
Yeah, it was, to be honest, the biggest change was pulling the kitchen out. So essentially, because it's a 60s house, you know, in that era, they had these sort of boxed in kitchens. And this one had been partially opened up in that they'd knocked out the back wall of it, but it was still closed in on 3 sides.
Yeah, and it was right in the middle.
It was literally in the middle of the house. So a lot of our engineering cost was obviously putting beams in because they were load-bearing walls. So there was quite a lot of engineering into getting rid of that.
So what are load-bearing walls? Load-bearing walls, if you imagine you're in the roof space, which is a space between the ceiling and the roof, a load-bearing wall can be identified because there is some timber basically going down and strutting, resting on that wall. So that's basically transferring the load of the roof through the wall to the ground. If there's no timber resting on it, it means it's not load-bearing. Non-load bearing walls, because there's nothing resting on them, they can be easily knocked down and demolished at pretty low cost. Whereas when they're load bearing, the cost is going to depend on what size beam needs to be installed in there to take the support of the roof. So this is where, if you are doing some renovations at your place, getting an engineer to come over, pop into the roof space and work out which walls are load bearing and which walls aren't, that's going to help you understand what the cost implications are for removing those walls.
But for us, that sort of open feel to our main living area was really important. And so we knew that was the one thing we knew we wanted to do, was get rid of this boxed-in kitchen.
It doesn't make the space feel so much bigger.
Yeah, it's amazing. Like, it's not any difference really in terms of how much space we've got, but it feels like a totally different house.
Yeah. And then in terms of kitchen design and living design, you had the couch, which was a key requirement.
Yeah.
And no dining table?
That's just probably... It's one of those things where I say we're the bad family from Matilda at the moment.
The bad family from Matilda.
Where we sit and we, because Darcy really struggles with sitting at a table. That's one of the things that's really hard for him. Eating's just a really hard motor planning job, essentially. Like, for him, eating, and I guess it's that active motor planning that he actually has to do. So in some ways, for him, the only way we can get him to eat properly is actually by distracting him with something visual, so that he's not overthinking that process so much. Also, sitting in a chair is really tiring for him. So his OT had recommended pretty early on that we try and get as much of his body in contact with something solid, like a couch, which is comfortable, but you actually, more of your body touches a couch than it does a chair. So she'd sort of said early on, that's going to be something that's going to make eating easier for him. And so I had never really thought about, I guess, autism as something that affected those things.
No.
At all. Even chew and swallow is something, when he was really little, he was vomiting a lot. You just think of kids vomiting, but for him, when he gets tired, the motor planning of eating gets harder. And so often that gag reflex is because his swallow gets tired as he gets tired. So she'd always said, if you're going to have a family meal, it should be breakfast when he's not tired.
Right.
So we probably more often try and eat breakfast as a family than dinner. Is just calories in is a win.
Yeah.
Is where we sit on that one.
Okay.
And for him, that's also the only time he really eats anything of substance. Everything else is quite beige and crunchy. So it's really important that even though he's tired, we're able to, I guess, facilitate that being the most important meal in his day, but also the one where he's the most tired.
Yeah. It sounds like the OT plays a pretty critical role in understanding his spaces and how they're going to have to work for him.
Yeah, no, she actually came and did an assessment of our old house where we lived. So when COVID happened and we started doing one-on-one home visits, she actually came in and did like a physical space assessment. And she's the one who was like, the visual noise in this room is very intense because every toy we own, we can see.
Right.
And so at that time I had all these clear boxes because in my head I was like, oh, him seeing the toys, that'd be great. Then he'll know which one he wants. But she was like, that's so many things for him to be looking at. It actually means he can't focus on any one thing. So she's like, you need to get some pack away boxes where he can't see inside them.
Mm-hmm.
So she was, really important, I guess, in shaping my understanding of what he needed. And I guess because I'd spent so much time, because as parents, most of what we do early on in therapy is actually them training us to understand what's going on. So for us, we'd done so much work, I guess, trying to understand what would make things easier for him, that when we came to briefing the architect, we were pretty big on things like visual noise has to be low. We want a pretty low stimulation environment, lots of light, but also the ability in parts of the house to shut that light out.
Mm-hmm.
So that, it's funny. I didn't ever realize, I guess, the interaction between that occupational therapy side and architecture. And it's been a really interesting intersection, I think, of two things in our life, which I had no idea were connected.
Yeah. And do you know if OTs will commonly come out and do assessments?
I mean, we did our OT is amazing. She's a developmental OT, so she specifically works with kids with, I guess, sensory sensitivities. I don't think it's that common, but I think it's becoming more common. One of our friends at school is an interior architect. It's called the design of grounding, so it's her business, but it basically is looking at how sensory sensitivities and environmental spaces interact and how we can create better mental health through better design.
Yeah, love that.
Yeah, her work's really interesting about that intersection of design and psychology.
Right.
She started posting all this stuff in her business about orchids and dandelions, which is a theory about children that either you have dandelions who, like, you chuck them in a car park and they're going to grow. They can be like They can cope with all sorts of trauma and they will be okay. But then there's orchid kids who very easy, they're so environmentally sensitive. And certainly Darcy's one of those orchid kids where he is just incredibly responsive to the environment. And if you sort of build a greenhouse, there's this idea of building like a greenhouse in your environmental space so that they can thrive in like a really incredible way, but it's very easy to also inhibit that growth.
Yep. I like that.
And I guess by having to do all this reading around our son, I've realised how much of what I do is probably based on my own sensory preferences. And I think everyone has them. You're just not always conscious that you do those things. So, you know, I prefer to work in a largely dark room. I don't like working in rooms with lots of sunlight. And I never really thought anything of that until much later on when I sort of started to reflect on, I guess, my own preferences and understanding how that might impact on how efficient I am and how effective I am. Like open plan offices are probably for me a total nightmare. Like I did a PhD and I spent most of my time doing my PhD in a bedroom with the window shut and the door closed. But again, I don't think I'd linked that sort of physical space requirements to my effectiveness in other areas of my life until I sort of started to think about it more deeply.
Yeah, it's interesting.
Later on.
I mentioned before my day job is at the university, and in the libraries particularly, they've started adding in a lot of sensory rooms.
Yeah.
Where you can go in and it's all soft furnishing, so it's much quieter, much darker. There's weighted blankets, there's headphones.
Yeah.
And basically giving people who have those sensory requirements an opportunity to go into a space which is not as overwhelming, because the rest of it is open plan. You're in the bottom of the library. Lots of light, lots of noise, hard surfaces everywhere.
Yeah.
But it's taking a long time for that awareness to be formed in the built environment.
Yeah, I don't think people really, I think it's been really quite recent. And I think like the diagnosis of autism changed 10 years ago and it rolled all these like 50 disorders into this one spectrum. And I think in some ways it's almost a pity they called it autism because people have a preconception about what that is.
Yeah.
Whereas I think lots of people have sensory sensitivities that are impacted by the environment around them. And you're right, I think that it's this last sort of, I want to see people do more work in that psychology, I guess, and that occupational therapy and that architecture, interior design, because it can impact so heavily. Like you're right, every office I've ever worked in has been some hideous open plan partition, and I just don't do any work in those spaces. Unis, at least, I was able to bring a couch in, lock my door to an extent when I was working there. But again, like most academics don't actually work on campus. Quite interesting in I guess, a population where people, I would argue there is probably a higher proportion of sensory sensitivities than people who lean deeply into academia.
It's highly focused work that you're having to do.
Exactly. And so being in a busy environment is actually the last thing you want. And so, I always knew I needed a quiet environment. And then I all of a sudden realized why, I think is the thing.
And then did you, a little bit off topic, did you listen to the podcast The Imperfects?
Yes.
Did you listen to the one recently with the...
with Fern Brady,
yes.
It? Yeah. Oh, I loved it.
Great.
Yeah, because she normalizes it,
100%.
you know. And it's like this funny thing where everyone at the moment is like, oh, there's so much more autism. I'm like, no, there's not. It's not more autism. You know, it's a bit like if we were, we've got this early detection element where you can understand, you know, early detection of diabetes, for example. We'd go, that's amazing. But because now we're recognizing the different ways autism and sort of all developmental disorders present, I think people are still like, it's overdiagnosed. Oh, I didn't have that. I'm like, maybe you didn't know you did. I didn't think I was ADHD. And then I found out, you know, subsequent to my son's diagnosis that, definitely am. It's interesting. Then you reflect back and you're like, well, it's not that the diagnosis was that. It's just that I didn't understand myself.
And you'd found your own ways of accommodating that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I think people don't understand that difference in how that's happened. And sensory sensitivities are hugely impacted by the environment around you. I think building the house and it had sort of during this whole process is when our son was going through diagnosis and all of these things. He'd just been diagnosed, I think, when we contracted. And so it
was... As in when you the build part? The
build part. So when we did I think we knew lots was going on, but the formal diagnosis didn't come through until he was 3. So he'd been in therapy since he was 18 months. But he got diagnosed, and I think about 6 months later is when we signed all the contracts. Because diagnosis isn't the end point. Obviously, it's actually the starting point for understanding what's going on. So at the same time as we're doing all this design stuff, we've got our OT coming in and telling us all these things about the environment and the impact it has and how we should structure our family to make things easier for Darcy and for us. And it's been this really interesting sort of dual pathway of understanding our own sensitivities and trying to build a house at the same time.
Sounds like it was a pretty lucky timing thing that it worked out.
Very lucky.
And it could have been quite a different experience if you'd built without having those things front of mind.
Yeah, if we'd built before we had our kids, we would have built a completely different house.
It sounds like for people listening who have got kids with autism, the idea of asking their OT to assist them with that design is a really key takeaway.
Yeah, absolutely. We actually almost didn't know we were doing it. Things were just so difficult, and we happened to have her start to do home visits, I guess, at exactly the right time. So for us, I think it was a lucky coincidence. But it's now something that I tell friends who have children who are autistic or struggling, get your OT to do a sensory profile and then get her to come and look at your spaces and suggest how it might work better. And what is, is there something that you don't even know you're doing that's really triggering dysregulation in your child or in yourself? And yeah, for us, there were certain things like I knew that the process of getting out the door was really hard and that Darcy really struggled with it. And so my 50 mudroom inspiration pics probably spoke to that. But I didn't realise how the way in which we stored things and the way in which we were able to shut spaces off and open them out really impacted on him. Because I think in my head I was like, open plan, everything has to be open plan. But actually probably one of my favourite features is we've got this really big swing door between our living areas. And in my head, we'd always have it open. Like before we lived here, I'm like, oh, that's always going to be open. It'll be really good. And it is never open, ever. And it's actually really soundproof, which I didn't even know it would be. But that ability to really shut the noise in half of the house has been incredible. So it's sort of things we didn't even know that either the architect or our OT were able to really build in without us realising that we've all of a sudden been like, oh, that's actually really good.
What were some of the key sort of lessons that you took through the whole process?
Probably that it will be more expensive than you anticipate. But for us, they were based on decisions we made as well. So I don't think for us, we're quite lucky in that obviously our initial $500,000 budget was way out. But I think that was also based on doing nowhere near as much as we ended up doing. So we were able to, I guess, expand our budget because then we realised, well, if we do this, then we're not going to have to do anything else.
Sounds like that expectation got changed pretty quickly though, right?
Very early.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, it was not a surprise at the end. It was a very early budget discussion about, well, what are the things you actually want to do? You could do X, Y, and Z for this amount, but if you can push it to this, we can do so much more. And so for us, it became this decision of like, we're going to build a house that for us, we can stay in for 20 years. And I think thinking also because at the time house prices were going absolutely insane in Perth, we probably also started to think about this idea like, are our kids going to move out at 18? Probably not. So how are they going to live in this house as young adults and us not be on top of each other all the time? And I think also with Darcy, we were like thinking, he was very young then, was very young, but thinking he may not leave home and what our expectations and parameters around, him being around possibly longer than our other kids or not. We don't really know what that's going to look like, but having a house where there could be semi-independent living and also having older parents, we basically left the master suite downstairs exactly as it is with the expectation that possibly one or the other of our parents may move in with us at some point, or it might be one of our kids who lives there.
Yeah, that's good.
I think, I don't know, our generation of parents all seem terrified of the idea of care. And so you can see that the pressure, like our parents are all in their mid-70s and they're fine. They obviously all live independently now, but you can see by their mid-80s that might not be the case.
Yep.
And having an option where they can, in what we've got now, they would actually be able to have almost a separate entrance if they wanted, and they could shut the doors and essentially have a separate sort of study, bedroom, bathroom. And so that sort of, I guess, multi-generational living was something we really were thinking about for a variety of reasons.
So you very much had the opportunity with the floor plan of the house, how it was, to do it at almost no no real cost. It was sort of there.
Yeah.
If you didn't have that opportunity, do you think you would have added it in?
I think given at that stage we weren't sure if Darcy would be verbal or not, yes.
Yep.
Because we just weren't sure what his needs would be. And I think because Andrew went to medical school, we both met at law school. Neither of us are lawyers. And then he went back immediately to medical school. So we all stayed home quite a long time. Yep. So we sort of knew there was a likelihood that one or the other of our kids is probably going to stay home.
Yeah, okay.
In their early 20s, mid-20s.
Yep.
People aren't moving out as early now. So we wanted that option. If we were building a house that we thought could serve us through that period of our life, we didn't want to have to move in order to get that. So that was something we were quite, I guess, was front of mind for us.
Yep. Okay. And this is my own naivety around autism. When you say non-verbal, as in how old was he until, like, were those concerns were there? Like, how does that?
So he didn't start talking till he was about 4.5. And so we really weren't sure what that was going to look like.
Yeah, wow.
Because we didn't have any way to communicate with him at that point. So we were not sure whether, and kids use devices and I didn't know anything about this, but I probably always had thought that children who didn't speak also had an intellectual disability, which isn't the case, but I didn't know that at the time. And so we just had no idea. We had no way of assessing what his needs would be because we really didn't have any insight into what his level of disability was going to be.
What was the level of communication like between you guys then?
Very poor. Very poor, right. Which probably explains a lot of the meltdowns and the running away because we weren't able, he'd watch TV. We initially thought he was deaf. It's probably one thing. But I was like, do you like the visual stimulation or do you like this show? I remember not knowing what his favourite show was or whether he liked a song or something he was looking at. Is it just a colour? Are you just looking at a colour or do you like octonauts because it's ocean, or is it just that it's really visually stimulating? And not knowing, really not feeling like I knew him was quite hard. That was really
very hard,
difficult. And I think it's one of those things. I remember our speech there saying, if he can talk, he will talk. But if he can't, there are other ways. There's some kids who are completely non-verbal, not intellectually disabled, and when they get these devices and learn to read, their whole world opens up a little bit. And for us, it was a bit like that with Darcy, is when we were able to just get a little bit of language, not even a huge amount. He's probably always going to have communication challenges, but now I don't feel I'm ever at a loss as to knowing what he needs, wants, and But I think that communication piece is so difficult in that early stage.
Yeah. Because your education around it now is just trumps what you knew then.
Oh, I didn't think he was autistic because he laughed and hugged me and was really affectionate.
You had a box of what it needed to fit into.
I had a really specific box, and I remember sitting even in therapy, we'd been in therapy for 18 months, being like, I'm so lucky I don't have an autistic child. And then I look back on it now and I laugh because I'm like, he's definitely autistic. He's always been autistic. It's just I didn't understand what autism was. So as my understanding expanded, that completely changed how I perceived the whole thing.
Yeah. So what does it look like for him?
He's actually really verbal now. Once he was able to talk, it just changed our whole world because we could work out what he needed and wanted. He's in a mainstream school with support. So that's the other thing. We weren't sure whether he'd need to be in a special school. Sure. What's he going to need? What's that going to look like for him? And right now there's still definitely challenges and friendships are really tricky, but he's in a mainstream school and doing really well.
Yeah.
And our school's been amazing. It's the other reason we bought in this area is because our school that we were going to send them to was nearby. So we were really lucky that we were able to sort of be 5 minutes from school because I am there a lot. Because of Darcy, I am there a lot.
Yeah, okay.
So that sort of area became really important to us.
Yeah, no. Thanks for sharing that.
Yeah.
Was there anything when you moved into the house that was a pleasant sort of surprise or was different to how you thought it was going to sort of feel, or were there particular spaces that you're really happy with how they turned out, or maybe you weren't so happy? Was there anything that jumps out like that?
We moved in without our landscaping being done. So, and because the landscaping is such a big part of how the back feels, it almost like we got to move in twice.
Okay.
Because we got to move in and look at the desert of dirt out the back for 4 months. And then I remember the day the lawn went down and it just changed that whole area dramatically. all of a sudden, all the things Simone had told us at the start about the connection between the front yard and the backyard and being able to sit in the front yard and see right through to the back made sense.
So those 4 months where you're like, gosh, you lied to us.
I was like, it feels very dry out here. It felt like living in a desert a little bit.
Yeah.
So in some ways it was really nice because we got to move in and enjoy the internal spaces, and then all of a sudden this landscaping just changed the whole feel of the entire house.
Yep.
So that was definitely a surprise. Probably the other thing is the high windows I talked about earlier. Mm-hmm. They actually capture all the trees outside, which was again something I didn't know would change how it feels inside. So having all these, you can wake up upstairs and you see green through the high windows as well as the slightly lower ones. Yep. So that was really a nice surprise. Yes. And like our bathroom upstairs is all black as well. Like again, I was like I'm glad we trusted them because I definitely instinctively would have been like, it's going to be so dark. It's going to be really depressing and dark and awful. But again, because those high windows capture the tree line, it actually makes it feel really private, but also not like you're in the middle of the city, which has been really nice.
This is something that architects particularly can do very well. I've walked into houses where you walk upstairs and the window was done in a way where it looked like a painting on the wall because it just perfectly framed this big ghost gum tree outside of it. And it was just, they knew exactly, I'm going to capture that. And this is the height to cut out the roof next door and to frame all of the right parts. It makes such a difference with then how those landscapes interact with the house.
Yeah, it's amazing. One probably the error I made, which is not a big one and I'm fine with it, is I insisted on lowering the window in our room, not the high one, the other one. She's like, you want to see the roof? And I'm like, I don't care, that's fine. I just don't want it to feel dark. And it doesn't matter, but I don't think it would have mattered if it had been higher. Yeah. So that was probably a trust your architect. They know what they're doing. And I think through this whole process, it's like that gut feel of like, we like what you do. We probably just need to let you do it.
Yep.
Once I felt like she had a good understanding of who we were as a family and what our needs were, I think the best thing we did was probably let go of control to an extent and let them really go with the design at that point.
If you've got the right team and you're confident you've got them, absolutely. But then if you're from the other side and you guys were fortunate that you didn't have it, if you're seeing red flags, that's when you've got to step in and stop it, because if you don't, it's going to create so many more issues. But I think you had all of the cues. They were asking you the right questions. There was relationships there in terms of long-term relationships with the architect and the builder, and you were able to see some of their properties, and they were ticking all of those boxes for going, yes, we know what we're doing.
Yeah. No, and we had a friend who was building at the same, sort of doing the same process as us at the same time, and they were working with a builder and they didn't ask them all those questions. So we were kind of comparing notes at the time, and I was like, oh no, we've had to answer this really detailed question about like what I'm carrying as I leave the house and where do I come into the house from? How do I bring shopping in the house? And our friend hadn't been asked any of those questions really. They'd been asked for a list of rooms that they needed, not how they lived in those rooms. Yep. And I think they ended up parting ways with their architect and actually going with someone else instead of sinking $50,000 into an architect they didn't end up using. Yep. So we're quite lucky in that I knew that our experience was not necessarily the norm. But it was like that relationship piece was almost the first thing we did, was spend some time with Lauren and Simone explaining ourselves. And because I then trusted that they knew who we were, and also their designs, it's quite funny. I think if you have that piece first, we were not ever miles apart on anything. It's not like the concepts that they came up with, those initial couple of concepts. I think any of those probably would have worked for us. Yep. So once we were able to sort of pick one, they got even more of a sense of what we wanted, and then we were able to really keep saying, in the end the builder would ask me a question, I'm like, can you just go ask Lauren? I don't have a good answer to which black tile you should pick. Yes. Someone else needs to decide that. Like, we would be terrible clients if we weren't asked those questions. I could not come up with a brief for the life of me. We would have come up with a completely different house if we'd just sent them a list of rooms we wanted and things that, we might have had a really good mud room because I was definitely clear on what I wanted there. But
it would have been all a mud room.
It would have been all mud room. I don't think any of the things about separate spaces, or I think that is something that came out of the process of them understanding what it was that we liked, didn't like, and what would work for our family.
That's all plugged to Simone there.
Yeah, basically. Yeah.
Final two questions. One of them is, Would you go down the build process again?
I mean, yeah, Andrew says that I probably really enjoyed the build because I was so uninvolved and unstressed about it. Because I'm probably someone who trusts people instinctively. As once we build that relationship, I was like, they don't want it to go badly, so I'm just going to let them do their job. And Andrew, of course, was across all the details, so I also quietly knew that he would be across checking things, which was nice. I think we would do it again because I don't know that you ever get actually something that works for your family if you don't go through that process. And I don't think it necessarily has to be a full build. You know, we worked out at the end, we probably could have built a project where Brown Neve's home from scratch. I don't know if cheap, but certainly for a pretty similar cost. And everything would have been new, but we actually really liked this house is one of the things we liked about it is that it was an older house. It did have some features we really liked. We loved the facade. We still have that. And we were able to get something that I think was really bespoke to what we needed.
Yeah.
So I think we would absolutely do it again.
Yeah. Yeah, nice. And then the other question is around sort of final cost compared to the 500, but when that budget got reset, did it increase sort of like 20, 30% on top of?
I'm trying to remember. I think our original mental budget was like 800 to 900 and we ended up at like 1.2.
Yeah.
So it's more, but again, some of those were decisions we made along the way about like we wanted to go with the natural stone was quite a big cost, and you know there was some paving around our pool that we really liked that was expensive. So we made decisions along the way that increased the cost rather than it just blowing out.
Yes, you weren't passengers and victims to it. It was you were driving the process, and every decision was this is what we want and this is why we want it. It's a conscious decision to.
Yeah, and we did things at certain points to bring the cost down. So, you know, we took a lot of steel out, we took a lot of brick out. Yeah. So we made decisions along the way to pull money out of particular areas, but then invest it in other areas. So it was definitely more than we anticipated. But I also think we probably have watched enough grand designs to know that was going to be more than we had. We were quite lucky in that sense that I think we had realistic expectations about being poor at understanding what a budget was.
Yeah.
So I think if you go into it having a hard budget that is your absolute capacity, you need to probably lower it so that you have some flex to make decisions later as opposed to being your absolute maximum capacity going in.
There's also a conversation that needs to happen in terms of you communicating your budget to the project team where let's say that budget's 800,000. If it's 800,000 including the architect's fees, the consultant's fees, engineers, landscape architects, landscaping and furniture, like in terms of soft furniture, you need to communicate that to them.
Yeah.
Because then the build budget might be 600.
This is it. I think if you need to be clear about what you're including when you say it's going to be X amount. But I would say that I need to leave like a significant proportion because also you want the capacity to be like, I really love that stone. I want that stone and be able to do that without feeling like
if your starting budget is your maximum threshold, that's not the best place to be starting.
No,
don't do a build.
This is it. Don't do a build. So I think start at try and work out what you can do for 70%, and then by the time you get there, you'll probably end up with a better product with an allowance to do those extra bits that you wanted.
Yeah, and then also communicate to the architect your build budget versus like the whole budget, and make sure that they're explaining what all the fees will be, so you can buffer that into it.
This is it. Yeah, and one of the things we liked is Simone and Lauren were quite big on making sure we understood what we were committing to.
Yeah.
So there were definitely points where like, wow, that is a lot more than we anticipated. And certainly the period in which we built, we were told previously probably it could have been an 800, but because of the timing, it wasn't. But at the same time, that's when we were building.
Yeah.
And, you know, I think it actually got worse, to be honest, rather than better. But I think people sometimes are like, oh, we'll just wait it out. It's going to come down. And the reality is the population's expanding, the borders opened, and I think probably building got harder, not easier in some ways.
Yeah, awesome. Hey, thank you so much for our chat today.
That's all right. No worries.
That was a long one, but it was good. Thanks, Jen.
That's okay. No problem. It was nice being here.
Cheers. And thank you for tuning in to today's episode. Hope you enjoyed Jen's story today and got some ideas and inspiration for your own project. And remember, if you're a parent of a child on the spectrum or with sensory sensitivities, you're not alone. And if you're not sure if that could be your child, or if it is, there's some great resources that we've touched on in the episode, which will be links to those will be available in the show notes. That includes some books, The Orchid and the Dandelion, Why Sensitive People Struggle and How All Can Thrive by W. Thomas Boyce. The Highly Sensitive Person by Dr. Elaine N. Aaron, as well as a couple of different links to, there's blue light blocking LED lights and bulbs for lamps, as well as downlights. And I guess there's also the aspect of there's some things you can look at yourself to get you a bit of an idea. But if you do want to take it the next step further, certainly consider an OT assessment, whether you're thinking about a renovation and a build to inform that, or if you're already in a house and that's something that you think could be a good idea, definitely worth going down the path. Basically, what an OT will do is they will come into your environment, observe if it's for yourself or your child. They basically look at those routines, the daily routines that you're going through, how you're interacting with the space, what seems hard, what's limiting, where frustration seems to be arising. They'll assist you with understanding where your home layout is letting you down, and some of those challenges can be to do with a lot of new homes or renovations have open plan living. And when you think about the concept of open plan living, you've got 3 spaces traditionally contained into separate rooms all together. So sure, what does that mean? Well, it can be really noisy. You can have someone cooking, you can have someone watching TV, there could be people studying or trying to study at the dining table, or people talking somewhere else. For certain people, that's fine, but for other people, that's going to be really challenging and could be a bit stressful. And that was one of the things that Jen touched on with her own layout, where they had a room connected to the open plan living, which really acted as, I guess, a bit of a reprise, a private sort of space for the kids. It allowed them to have that connection by having the door open, or to keep it closed and have that separation. Key difference as well in the spaces, open plan living, it's all hard materials. It's noisy because of that. So thinking about how that works for your house, OT is going to be great at that. They'll assess your sensory needs, what's triggering you, what are your sensory preferences, and they'll be able to give you some practical advice. So those could be some of those short-term quick wins, which could be furniture placement, colours, materials, textures, how to create more calming environments for yourself or your kids, as well as some of those other long-term things which could inform the brief for your home project. And remember, the best architect or builder is only as good as the information that they get. So the better you can inform that briefing process, the better the product's going to be. If you've got any queries, as always, reach out. Head to the website, australianbuildstories.com, or you can email me, hello@sampayne.com.au. Until next time, thanks.